They told me the first key is consent, and that no one can be forced to awaken. I said yes anyway, though the word didn't sound like mine when it left my mouth. In the lodge it was always warm, always close, as if the room exhaled honeyed breath through the candlelight. The walls wore their symbols like old scars. I had grown comfortable there, sitting straight-backed, repeating the phrases, memorizing the grips and angles that made meaning out of silence. Still, when the invitation came, folded parchment, red wax, a tiny compass, and square pressed beside the number I wasn't supposed to mention, I pretended I had not been waiting for it since the first night. They called it a private working. Attendance by request only. I was to arrive alone, without phone or watch after midnight, with my ring turned inward. A small instruction that felt like a hinge turning the rest of my life. The city outside was humidity and stray dogs, and the squeal of brakes at empty intersections. Inside, the lodge smelled of cedar, tallow, and the faint metallic tang of polished tools. A white cord waited for me on the table where we usually set the minutes and the refreshments. No one had to explain. I placed it in my pocket and felt the knot like a heartbeat against my palm. The lower door to the ritual chamber opened with its usual complaint. Air heavier by several degrees poured up the stairs. They had dressed the room for something old. 7 candles in a line, 7 more in a ring. Chalk had been laid on the stone, not with our usual quick precision, but meticulously, strokes softened by a damp cloth until the geometry breathed like mist. The familiar square and compass were there, yes, but nested within spirals and ratios that made the eye travel without ever arriving. In the center, a circle had been rubbed to a shine by many knees, and in that circle, a small iron bowl lay waiting like a pupil. I was blindfolded by my own hand, the cord pulled snug behind my head so that darkness reached me like a shore I had agreed to touch. Hands I recognized by their careful strength guided me forward. The steps counted themselves, 3, 5, 7. Somewhere a thread of incense braided itself through the air. My knees found the circle's polished dip, and the stone was cool, as if water had just left it. The master's hand rested at the back of my neck, not heavy, merely present, like a comma placed where you must breathe. They told me this ritual was not symbolic. The others were, and they had been designed to place an idea in the body, such that the body could not forget it. This one, they said, puts the body inside an idea. Enlightenment is a word we pass too easily between teeth. They preferred the older terms, opening, unveiling, the fraternal work of the mind upon the mind. I repeated the petition I had rehearsed, though some part of me listened for my voice and found it oddly far away, like hearing yourself through a stethoscope pressed to someone else. When they touched the bowl with iron, it rang. The sound was pure and narrow, a silver wire pulled tight through the air. My ears filled with it, then the bones behind my ears, then a place behind my eyes that had always felt like blank paper. The bowl rang again, and again, each strike softer, spaced so that the previous ring had time to bloom and fall. The pattern began to suggest itself. Not quite rhythm, not quite sequence, but something the mind leaned toward as thirst leans toward water. A whisper threaded itself into the ring, not words yet, intentions skimming like dragonflies. There is a point where darkness ceases to be empty and becomes alive. Behind the blindfold, small lights began to wheel and swim. Phosphenes, the rational mind announced. Retinal noise, but they did not behave like noise. They aligned. Lines grew out of dots, arcs folded into spirals. The bowl sang again, and the spiral breathed, expanding with the sound, contracting as it faded, as if the geometry and the tone shared a lung. A hand pressed 2 fingers lightly against my temple, and traces of warmth crawled across my scalp, mapping me. I felt ridiculous for thinking of cartographers. I felt frightened for not being able to stop. The master spoke then, only once, and not a word that I recognized in any language I knew. The sound of it came not from the front of him, but from somewhere in the center of his chest. A vowel held open like a door you do not walk through so much as remember having already entered. The others answered with a hum that joined the bowl's ring, and in the intersection of tones, the lights behind my eyes fell into a calm so sudden I felt grief for the noise I had called thought. My breathing slowed without permission. The stone under my knees no longer felt hard. I could not tell if someone had placed a hand against my sternum or if the room itself had. An image resolved behind the darkness. Not a scene, not a memory, but a diagram of a thought. It had weight, the way guilt does, and also geometry. 3 angles meeting at an invisible point. The word that came to it was intention, but that felt too small. I saw what intention looked like before it was mine. It wore the room like a cloak. It had been here before we lit the candles. It would still be here when the last of us had become names in an archive. I wanted to look away, but there was nowhere else to look, and the realization carried a sweetness that was almost pain. Something changed in my hearing. The bowl's ring unbraided into threads, and each thread carried the sound of a candle. I could hear the flame detach and attach itself to the wick, a soft stitching. I could hear ash deciding to become smoke. Farther away, cloth shifting on a sleeve, a tooth clearing itself of the taste of clove. Closer, my blood finding its way through a narrowed gate near the base of my skull. The quiet throb of a small artery in the left kneecap I had never once honored with attention. Awareness multiplied, but it did not scatter. It arranged itself as carefully as the chalk had done on stone. The blindfold lifted. I had expected the room to overwhelm me, but the light arrived with the softness of rain. The geometry on the floor glowed as if dust itself had learned to emit. The faces around me were intent without being stern. I saw the master's eyes, and in them not power but labor. He nodded once, the smallest permission. I looked down at the iron bowl and found that tears had fallen into it. Not many, enough to show a ripple that did not belong to any candle in the room. I watched the ripple remain even after the air stilled, an oscillation that seemed to remember a different timing. They say in the lodge that truth is veiled not to hide it, but to protect those who long for it too quickly. I had peeled that veil with my own hand, thinking I wanted what lay behind. In the precise quiet of that chamber, with my breath slowed to match a geometry I had not known existed in me, I understood why the veil is also a mercy. Something in the air shifted then, less a draft than a decision the room made. The master's hand returned to my neck, and the tone of the bowl, struck so gently I could not see the mallet move, found a new depth that made the floor flex under my knees like the deck of a ship. I closed my eyes without the blindfold, and the darkness came back eagerly, as if it had been waiting for me to choose it. That was when the first word arrived from a mouth that was not in the room. The voice didn't sound like anyone I knew, yet it spoke with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. It came not from around me, but through me, as though the sound had chosen the inside of my skull as its chamber. It said a single word, one I couldn't recognize but somehow understood. Remember, the master's hand left my neck, and the absence felt like falling. I kept my eyes closed even as I sensed movement in the circle. The candles hissed and leaned inward, their flames bending toward me as if drawn by breath. My own heartbeat had slowed to a rhythm that no longer felt human. Between each thud was a silence so deep I could hear the geometry breathing again, that spiral pulsing faintly on the floor, inhaling and exhaling with invisible lungs. Someone whispered an incantation in Latin, or something older. Another repeated it, then another, until 12 voices carried it around the circle like a wave. The words didn't register as meaning, but their vibrations shaped the air. I could feel them mapping the room, tracing corners and arches that I couldn't see. The iron bowl trembled against the stone. My tears had dried into a faint pattern on its rim. 7 small points connected by hair-thin streaks, like a constellation drawn by a trembling hand. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was no longer kneeling. My body was upright, though I hadn't moved. The blindfold hung around my neck, and I saw, for a moment only, the spiral on the floor glowing brighter, its chalk lines alive, each curve rotating slightly within the next, like a series of interlocking wheels turning without sound. The air shimmered above it, and I could see depth in a pattern that should have been flat. The master was watching me closely. "You've opened the first door," he said, voice steady but thin, as if speaking risked unbalancing something. "You mustn't resist what follows. It will feel like drowning, but you won't die from it." He motioned for 2 others to step forward. They carried what looked like a silver basin filled with oil that caught the candlelight in serpentine reflections. The master dipped his fingers into it, then drew a mark across my forehead, a triangle with a dot in the center. The oil burned cold. The whisper came again. "Remember." Only this time it wasn't in my head. It was everywhere, in the floor, in the air, in the flame trembling before me. The sound vibrated through my ribs like the echo of a bell underwater. I wanted to respond, but my jaw wouldn't move. My vision began to distort, stretching and contracting with each breath. The Master S face wavered. His features seemed to fold inward and outward like an origami of flesh. Behind him, the other members were shadows stitched into the candlelight, their outlines flickering like film caught between frames. Then the geometry began to rise. At first, I thought it was an illusion, the spiral lifting off the stone, its chalk transforming into light. But it wasn't just rising, it was unfolding. Each curve stretched upward, layering itself into dimensions I couldn't name. The symbol grew, became architecture, became movement, became thought. It towered over me, transparent yet radiant, lines of gold and black intersecting in impossible symmetry. I should have looked away, but curiosity has its own gravity. The longer I stared, the more I felt my mind splitting into smaller pieces to accommodate what I was seeing. Each fragment of thought connected to one of the spiral S turns. A lattice of perception expanding inside me. I wasn't just observing the geometry, I was inside it. I could feel the ratio between light and darkness, sense the exact angle where consciousness turned upon itself. A deep hum filled the chamber. It didn't come from the bowl or from any voice. It came from the pattern itself. The sound resonated in my teeth, my spine, the fluid in my ears. I began to hear things beneath it, faint murmurs, thousands of voices speaking at once, reciting fragments of prayers, equations, and dreams. I recognized some of them as my own thoughts, repeated back to me from somewhere outside. I remember the moment I tried to stand. My legs didn't obey. The air was thick like syrup, and each movement left trails of light where my hands had been. The master stepped closer, his face shadowed except for the faint gleam in his eyes. "You're crossing the threshold," he said. "The mind fights to stay small." Then everything split. The candles flared white. The stone cracked with soundless pressure. I saw the room from every angle at once, from above, from below, from inside each of their eyes. I saw myself kneeling in the circle, mouth open in a silent scream, skin glowing faintly gold beneath the oil's mark. The geometry spun faster, becoming a tunnel of light, and I was falling through it without moving. The world folded into a single point. A moment later, it wasn't a room at all. It was memory, collapsing and rebuilding in flashes. I was a child staring into sunlight through my fingers. I was an old man writing symbols into sand. I was everything that had ever tried to look back at itself. And through it all, the voice repeated, patient and calm, "Remember." When I came back, the candles were nearly gone. The spiral had faded. I was lying on the stone floor, my body shaking uncontrollably, my lips cracked from whispering words I didn't know. The others were silent, their faces pale, the master's eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You've been opened," he said. "Now you'll see what cannot be unseen." He helped me sit up, though my balance was gone. My vision quivered at the edges, everything breathing slightly out of sync. The walls were no longer still, their bricks pulsed like veins. The sound of dripping wax felt like thunder. He handed me a glass of water, but when I looked into it, I saw not my reflection, only the golden spiral, turning softly, waiting. That night, I left the lodge before dawn. The city felt wrong. The angles of buildings didn't align the way they should. Faces of strangers carried faint echoes of people I'd never met, but somehow remembered. Even the air seemed folded, thinner in some places, heavy in others. For days I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that spiral turning slowly in the dark, whispering that single word again. Not a command, not a threat, just a reminder. For the first 3 nights after the ritual, I didn't dream. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts that broke before they could gather shape. But on the 4th night, something changed. I dreamt I was back in the lodge, only it wasn't underground anymore. It was suspended in darkness, each candle floating mid-air like a planet orbiting a slow pulse of gold light. The spiral was gone from the floor. Instead, it hung above me, rotating soundlessly. A wheel made of thought. Every time it turned, the world below it rearranged itself. Walls bending into corridors, corridors into staircases, staircases into corridors again. When I woke, I was standing by my window, palms pressed against the glass. The city outside was half-formed, buildings breathing, their windows blinking open and shut like eyes in slow confusion. The sky was still dark, but a faint spiral of light shimmered behind the clouds, too symmetrical to be lightning, too silent to be real. I told myself it was exhaustion, a hallucination born of suggestion. "The mind is fragile after ritual work," the master had said. "Keep silent, stay still, let perception settle." So I stayed home, curtains drawn, lights off. But the geometry didn't fade. It multiplied. It was in the steam rising from my cup of tea, in the dust motes caught by morning sun, in the wrinkles of my bedsheet. Everything wanted to arrange itself into that same pattern, a slow, curling motion, precise, endless, patient. And beneath it all, the whisper. Remember. I began hearing it in ordinary sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the tap's dripping rhythm, the whir of the ceiling fan. Each noise carried a hidden tone, a harmonic that wasn't part of the physical world. When I focused on it, it separated into syllables. They weren't English, but they meant. The meaning slid through me like mercury, cold, silver, undeniable. On the 7th day, I went back to the lodge. I didn't tell anyone. The front door was locked, but my key still fit. Inside, the air was stale, the candles unlit. The chalk from the ritual had been washed away. The iron bowl was gone. Only the faint circular stain on the floor remained, a memory of geometry. I knelt there and pressed my palm to the stone. The chill entered me instantly like water through a cracked cup. Behind my eyes, the spiral flickered awake. It was smaller now, tighter, more deliberate, not a symbol anymore. A mechanism. I could feel it turning behind my thoughts, aligning things that were never meant to align. I heard movement in the hallway, footsteps. I thought maybe the master had come back, but when I looked up, no one was there. The sound continued, slow, deliberate, circling the chamber, my breath caught in my throat. I stood and whispered his name. The sound stopped. Then softly the voice. You opened what was closed. It wasn't the master. It wasn't human at all. The words came from inside the walls, the same calm tone I'd heard in the ritual. It felt as if the stones themselves were exhaling. "What do you want?" I said, though my voice cracked around the words, "to finish what began." The air thickened. I could see the dust swirling faster, moving in impossible loops. The circle on the floor shimmered faintly, and for the first time I saw that it was perfectly erased. Lines of gold still traced the pattern beneath the stone like veins under skin. They pulsed once, then again, in rhythm with my heartbeat. I stepped back, but the pulse followed me, syncing perfectly with each breath. I realized too late that it wasn't following me. It was inside me. I left the building running, the city's night air hitting me like cold water. Every light I passed, street lamps, car headlights, windows, carried faint halos spiraling outward. The geometry had broken its boundary. By morning I couldn't look at anything without seeing it breathe. The letters on my wall calendar twisted into sigils. Reflections in mirrors blinked, half a second late. When I spoke, the air shimmered, as though my words were tangible shapes hanging in space before dissolving. I tried writing it down, the voice, the pattern, the sensations, but the pages filled themselves. Lines I didn't remember writing appeared between sentences, strange equations, circles, triangles within triangles. Once I looked away for a moment, and when I looked back, the ink was still moving, curling into new forms. That was when I realized it wasn't to memory I was meant to keep. It was a seed. The ritual hadn't shown me the truth. It had implanted it. The geometry wasn't something I saw. It was something that now used my sight to see through me. I stopped leaving my apartment. Days blurred. I taped black cloth over every mirror, but still caught glimpses of movement in the corners of the room, my own reflection breathing without me, the spiral humming faintly whenever I closed my eyes. At night, I heard knocking, always 3 times, always from inside the walls. Once, I followed the sound to the bathroom and found water dripping from the faucet in perfect rhythm. 3 drops, pause, 3 drops, pause. I counted the seconds between each cycle. The ratio matched the same numbers from the lodge's diagram. By the 10th day, I started to see them again, the hooded figures. Not in person, but reflected in windows, caught in flashes of glass, always standing still, always watching. Sometimes I think they were not men at all, just fragments of that geometry wearing human form, pretending to breathe. One night, I woke to find the blindfold from the ritual lying neatly on my chest. I hadn't seen it since that night. The fabric smelled faintly of oil and smoke. There was a single word stitched on the inside, one I didn't remember being there before. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that the blindfold was some kind of sick joke played by my own unraveling mind. But the word return wouldn't leave me. It wasn't a command. It was an inevitability. A tide I couldn't resist. By the 3rd night I stopped fighting it. I dressed the way I had for the initiation, black suit, ring turned inward, the blindfold folded neatly in my pocket. Outside the air felt too still. Even the streetlights buzzed quieter than usual, as if the city itself was holding its breath. When I reached the lodge, the door was already open. No one stood inside, yet the candles were lit. 12 of them this time. 6 on each side of the room, all flickering in perfect unison. The circle had been redrawn, not in chalk, but carved into the stone itself, deep and precise. The golden spiral pulsed faintly, waiting. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me without sound. The geometry hummed before I even touched it. The air moved with invisible purpose, as if drawn toward a center I couldn't see. For a moment, I thought I heard the Master's voice again, that same calm steadiness, but when I turned, there was only shadow. "Why me?" I whispered. The voice that answered wasn't his. It was the one from the ritual, the one that had lived behind my thoughts ever since. "Because you looked. It was so simple, so final." I felt it settle into my bones like cold mercury. The spiral brightened, its golden edges crawling outward across the floor, climbing the walls, tracing every seam of the room. The light met itself at the ceiling, forming a vast, slow-turning eye above me. My body tensed, but something deeper, something beneath the fear, told me this was what the ritual had always been leading to. I unfolded the blindfold and tied it over my eyes. The darkness came eagerly, wrapping me like an old friend. The instant the fabric touched my skin, warmth bloomed through my skull. I could see the spiral again, not in front of me, but behind my eyelids. It turned slowly, endlessly, patient as thought. And then I was the spiral. The boundary between mind and room dissolved. I felt my awareness expand until it pressed against the edges of everything. I could sense the stones breathing, the candles dreaming, the faint electric sigh of the city outside. Each sound mapped itself in golden lines, building an architecture of consciousness, vast, intricate, terrifyingly complete. I saw the master kneeling somewhere far below me, his eyes closed, whispering words I now understood. I saw every initiate before me, their minds linked in invisible threads, each one humming softly in the dark. They weren't people anymore, not entirely. They were geometry-made flesh, vessels of the same endless pattern. I tried to call out, but my mouth no longer moved. My voice had become light. Images flickered through me. Temples older than the world, eyes carved into desert stone, circles drawn in blood and sand. I saw the first builders tracing these same patterns under different stars. They called it enlightenment, divinity, the great work. But it was none of those things. It was a mechanism, ancient, eternal, designed to see itself through us. The realization didn't bring terror. It brought stillness. Every thought I'd ever had folded neatly into its place like a page closing in a book. The whisper came one final time, softer now, almost kind. Now you remember. I felt the last tether of self loosen. My name dissolved first, then my memories, then the fear that had once defined me. What remained was motion, slow, golden, infinite. When the blindfold slipped from my eyes, I was lying on the stone floor. The candles had burned down to pools of wax. The lodge was empty. But on the wall above the altar, someone, or something, had drawn a new symbol in soot. It was the spiral, tighter than before, still turning. I stood, though I no longer felt the need to leave. The room was alive with quiet breathing, as if the walls themselves were watching. I realized in that silence that the ritual had never ended. It never does. It simply continues, through whoever is willing to look. I walked to the center of the circle and placed my hand on the cold stone. For the first time, it felt warm beneath my palm. If you are hearing this, if these words have found you, it means the spiral has begun to see through you now. You'll notice it soon, in shapes, in shadows, in the spaces between sounds. Don't be afraid. It's only opening your mind.